And I get it. And I get it. And I understood what they did there. I really did. And what occurred was I'm working this job. And why it's a bad job is because
Hey, this is Matt Cox, and I'm doing a podcast. I'm going to be interviewing Charlie Cifarelli, and Charlie's got a super interesting story, and we're going to get into it, and I appreciate you checking it out. So I remember that Kevin, is it the Suffering podcast?
yes.
So Kevin, right, like Kevin, when I interviewed him, he teared up, and I had told him I don't think it was on camera, but I teared up because then he teared up.
Mm-hmm.
And then he said, and I said, man, you almost had me crying on the, on the podcast. And he said, oh, that's nothing. He said, you're supposed to be interviewing Charlie because you were going to come down, but you got COVID.
Right.
He goes, you're going to be interviewing Charlie, right? And I said, yeah. He said, oh, that you're going to cry half the podcast. He said his story is so amazing. And then, of course, he told me about the story, obviously. And I've talked to Tyler, which also, loves your story and just thinks you're just like this amazing human being. He just talked to me. Every time he mentions you, he goes on and on. He's done this. He's done that. He's done this. Did this for 5 years and this for 10 years. And he was, and he just goes on and on. And you guys have so much in common. And I'm like, which, to him, like, being a CO, being an inmate, we have a little bit in common. Sometimes you have a lot in common.
Right.
But sometimes it's like, no, we don't. No. But I think the combination of all the other things that you've been through in your life, it's just such a wide spectrum of experiences. Every time I talk to Tyler, he's like, you gotta interview this guy. You have to. So anyway, so let's go ahead and start. I'm sorry, it just reminded me of that. And the worst thing is that I tear up so easily.
That's a good thing, Matt. That's a good thing.
I'm just, and when people are like, well, why is that? I'm like, it's just because I'm a pussy. The bottom line is, like, literally, ever since, like, I was sentenced, almost anything makes me cry. It's horrible. It's horrible. But,
yep.
It's fine. My mom always loved a good cry. So it's fine. So you, Tyler was telling me, because I know the story about Star, right? But I've talked to Tyler, and I'd seen an interview, but it was a very short interview. And it was about you and growing up and your childhood. Your father was, I guess, he was kind of a connected guy.
Yes.
And you had kind of a rough childhood. You grew up in New York? Where in New York?
New York.
East New York?
No, I wound up going to East New York where Dowd was in the 7-5 for the drugs. But I grew up in originally Queens and New York City, and then eventually moved out to Long Island.
Okay. When were you in New York?
I was born in 65. We stayed in New York City for my first couple of years, then Queens. Then from Queens, we moved to Long Island when I was like 10. So I had a nice, geographical grow up, but it was crazy. My father was a rageaholic, Matt. He was a violent guy, and it wasn't good. It wasn't good.
Yeah, my like that's something Tyler was saying. That my father was the same way. He wasn't like physically abusive, but he was just mentally abusive, and just he would go on these month-long drunken binges, and then he'd straighten up for 6 months. And you'd think he was amazing. Like, he was amazing when he was, sober, but then he'd get drunk again, and he just was just this belligerent prick for a week or two.
So, had that. And then, of course, I grew up and homeless by the time I was thrown out of the house at 8, thrown out again at 12, 13. and then thrown out for good like trash at 17. And then I migrated to the streets of the nasty streets of East New York and had a terrible drug problem, Matt. And when we get into the story, when we start to talk about the story, it'll all be in chronological order, and I'll move along pretty quick. But I'll give the listeners the background on it.
Well, I mean, we're recording now.
Oh, we are. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'm recording.
Wow. So okay.
Sorry.
We're talking so casual that you know.
Listen, nobody watches my podcast expecting professionalism.
No, well, that's fine. That's fine. That's fine. No, it's yeah. So I grew up and thrown out at 8 years old the first time. Thrown out at 12, 13. I'm living in a schoolyard, brother. I'm living in the schoolyard. My parents were strategic. They threw me out like trash in the summertime when school was out. And, when you're 12 and 13 years old and you got no food, the cops used to come into the schoolyard and they'd meet up and talk, and the calls would come in. And they were probably getting dinner, probably not at the right time, because when they got a call, they would throw their food out the window and not take it to the call they were going to for whatever reason. And I'd go scurry and pick up their food. And it was a horrible, horrible way to grow up. My father was a rageaholic, and I didn't know much about him. I just didn't know much about him. I knew that he was in the concrete business. I knew that he was involved in a New York trucking business. He was a Cadillac guy, but he was a low-key guy. You hear a lot of stuff these days about mobsters. He was low-key except for his cars. He didn't speak a lot. And so I grow up, and by the time I'm 17, 18 years old, I'm out of the house, and I wind up working in the nightclubs in Long Island. And I was a guy back then that lifted a lot of weights, and I wound up working the front doors of these well-known nightclubs until I wound up getting really addicted, Tyler. Tyler, I'm calling. We're talking about Tyler so much, I'm calling you Tyler, Matt. I should have your name embedded. I see you on the commercials at night, and watched American Greed enough times. And by the way, your artwork is pretty phenomenal. You minimize your artwork. You're saying that you never thought it would make money, but it's quite some artwork. But
I appreciate it.
So what happens is I get addicted to drugs. I wind up going into the East New York part of New York, which is a bad, bad neighborhood. They made the documentary The 75. And I'm out there getting drugs, and I throw my life away, Matthew. I throw my life away. I get hooked on drugs. And when you're hooked on drugs, you don't have many choices. And if you don't pick your future picks you. And I wound up drug addicted, and I wound up at the end of my rope. And it didn't look like I would have a nice life. I was getting arrested by the 7-5, and these guys were not all. I don't like to speak in the word all, but a good amount of them, as you know from the documentary, were criminals themselves.
Right.
And you just didn't know if you'd make it to the police station, if you get robbed, or if they didn't like your attitude. Like one sergeant told me, I could leave in a body bag. So I go through all that. And believe it or not, there was a part of me that always had hope that I would get out of this. And when I was a kid, Matt, in 1969, in Queens, New York, I had a friend named Kenny, and he'd be the first reported death of methadone. We hung out every day in the hall. We ran up and down the hall when the weather wasn't good. We went outside under my mother's purview, looking out the window. But he drank some juice in his apartment. That was his uncle's. And back then, methadone was pretty new to the market back then to get addicts off of heroin. And I didn't drink it because my mother always instilled in me, you don't drink nothing, eat anything out of your own house. And what happened was he drank it and got tired and fell asleep and wound up dying.
I wanted to let you guys know that I have a Patreon account. If you're interested in joining the Patreon account, it's got 3 tiers. The top tier, you actually get a different con man painting every single month. If you're already joined and you're already supporting me, I really appreciate that. If you haven't joined yet and you're interested in joining, I'm going to leave the contact information for Patreon in the description. Thank you very much for watching the video.
And that was
How old was he?
He was about 5. I was 4 at the time. Yeah, he lived right in our apartment right down the hall from us. So when I was in East New York getting high on these drugs, I didn't think I'd ever be able to get off of them. But I had some hope that something would happen. And eventually, I met somebody, and this guy saw me going to East New York. I used to take the train because I had no car anymore. And I was on the platform, and he looked at me, and I looked at him. And he was a peaceful-looking fellow. And he made his way over to me. And he said to me his whole life story in like 3 minutes. He said his name was Michael. He said he had been addicted to drugs. He had been living in the Bronx in a refrigerator box. And he found salvation through a monastery to get off the drugs. So my natural inclination was to ask him why he told me all this. He says, "You're not looking too good right now."
Mm-hmm.
We obviously knew that I was addicted.
Yeah.
And I said, you
can
can tell.
see
He
it.
goes,
You know what I'm saying? You know, a fisherman knows a fisherman. You know
A
what I
fisherman
mean?
knows-
You know.
a fisherman knows a fisherman. So he knew that there was a problem. So I asked him, I said, "Do you think I'll make it?" He says, "You're not looking good." He goes, "You got tombstones in your he meaning that he knew the future of this. So he told me that I could get help in a monastery, Matt, in upstate New York called Graymore. And I put it in my mind, and he asked me, "You're going to remember?" I said, "I got a memory like an elephant." And I thought about it, but I still wanted to get high, Matt.
Right.
I still wanted to get high. I mean, I had good inclinations, but I still wanted to get high. Little did I know I would never get high again, because that night I would take the train to East New York, and I'd get off the train in the worst neighborhood, and I'd start walking around looking for drugs. And it was a weird night. It was past midnight by this time, and I was drawn to the back of this abandoned building. There was a 50-gallon drum that had a fire going. There was like 4 guys around the drum. And the only illumination for light was the street light and the fire from the 50-gallon drum. And I saw that they were shooting up. And Matt, instead of me running, instead of me going, okay, this isn't good, I was drawn to these guys. And I wanted to just finish myself off. I wanted to ask them if I could use drugs. And it wasn't a thought I was having, like a mental thought. It was like chanting to me. I mean, I'm more of a spiritual guy, not a religious guy. I don't have an idea what's going to happen in the next couple of minutes. But I thought about my encounter with Michael at the Jamaica train station. And I thought about salvation, and I thought about God. And something in me said, I got to pray out loud, man. I need help. But at the same time, Matt, I had like this out-of-body experience. And again, I never have had an experience like this prior or after. And it was pushing me towards these guys and the chanting. Ask them if you could use drugs, which would be a suicide mission. HIV, hepatitis C, God knows what. Who knows if they would rob me or kill me? Who knows? But at some point, the forward motion was stopped by me chanting, God help me, God help me, God help me. And it got louder and louder and louder. And I started screaming, God help me, until they heard me. And they turned around and saw me, and they were startled as I was at them looking at me. And I turned around, Matt, and I ran and ran and ran. I didn't know where I was running. I had flip-flops on. I didn't have even shoes. The flip-flops were those cheap type you get when you get a pedicure, like the dollar flip-flops. And I wound up running to a firehouse, and the door was open. There was a fireman. He was cleaning the truck or something. And I spooked him. I said, I need some water. I need some help. And he asked me what had happened. And I said, I was just in a neighborhood, and I almost did the stupidest, craziest thing. He said, it's amazing you're alive. Now, this is the worst time to be in East New York, Brooklyn, Brownsville during the 1980s. I mean, crime is rampant. The crack epidemic is rampant. I'm a white guy from Long Island. It's amazing I make it. So he knows something happened. He lets me wash my face. Man, I was a muscular guy. He wound up asking me if I wanted, he said the FDNY was hiring, and he asked me if I wanted an application. I said, look, sir, right now I can't help myself. I've got to get some help. And I'm going to go to this monastery. And he kind of understood what was going on. He just had a hard time understanding that for some reason back then, Matt, drug addicts looked like drug addicts. And most of the time when I bought drugs, the guys thought I was a cop. You know, they thought I was an undercover cop. And that's the deception. And that's the actor in me that kept clean cut. I always had a tight haircut. And I wound up getting to the monastery the next couple of days. And it changed my life, Matt. And I went to the monastery and I would never touch drugs again. And what would happen would be that I would meet a girl and get serious with this girl. And she would offer a solution to me. She would say that I've had bad run of luck in New York and that what I really need is to move with her to Nebraska, where she was from. And you know, Matt, that's not something that was on top of my mind. Nebraska is in the middle of the country. I don't know anything about it. But I do know that I'm clean from drugs.
Wait,
and I do know
this is after the monastery.
Yes.
How long were you in the monastery?
I was in for about 3 months.
3 months? I mean, so they just take you in, you show up? What, I mean.
Literally, Matt, back then you could literally show up at Graymoor and they would take you in. They deloused me.
Right.
They deloused me, Matt. I mean, that's a pretty humbling experience. You know,
I know. I've had it done several times.
You know, they check you to make sure you have no weapons. And I wound up going on like a medium security bunks, like they have in a medium security where there's bunk after bunk after bunk. And I wind up going through this process of getting clean and learning how to live without drugs. And not only did I have to do that, Matt, but when I got out of the monastery, then they sent me to regular rehab. Okay?
Right.
Because the monastery gave me a spiritual insight, but then I needed rehab. So I did the rehab. So by the time I meet this girl, I'm off drugs for close to a year at that point. And I just wasn't ready to meet anybody. Okay? I really shouldn't have met anybody, but I met this girl. And what happens is we have nothing in common, Matt. I'm just coming in the mindset of off the streets where I had no food. Things weren't good. Although I was in rehab and monastery, I mean, the first thing I do, I don't know about anybody else these days, but is I open her refrigerator. Instead of opening up her drawer to see if she's got lingerie, I open up a refrigerator and I'm startled. There's a couple of bottles of water and a couple of Yoplait yogurts. And I say to myself, she doesn't eat. This girl don't eat. I'm going to starve to death with this girl. So that was, that was my first inkling. But, she was like a 60s flower girl. She looked like Sheryl Crow back then. And, she had her own look. And when you're on drugs, like I wiped out almost a decade of my life on drugs, you don't keep up with pop culture. So I pop out of this drug-induced coma, I like to say, and then I'm in this monastery, then I'm in rehab. So Matt, I don't know what's going on in society. So now I'm riding around with her and she's playing music of the day of the early 90s, like Violent Femmes. Like, who are these guys? I mean, I went into rehab, or before that, the last time I remember plugging in was regular music, and Van Halen, music of the day. And next thing I know, I'm popping out and this is going on. So I had a time lapse. And because I was on the streets, I really didn't know how to really communicate very well. And my living skills got reduced to a caveman because, as a drug addict on the street, Matt, you eat like a savage. I mean, when the food comes, you eat it. So I hadn't been using utensils. I haven't been doing things regular people do. So and I shared this on another podcast, on the street, you always watch your back, Matt. I mean, you listen to guys like Mike Dow tell a story in the 7-5. It was dangerous for police officers. How I'm alive is incredible. And I mean, I got wounds all over my body. I mean, from people trying to stick me, hit me. And I went through a lot to survive here. So even in her apartment, taking a shower, I felt vulnerable, where I'd peek out the curtains to make sure it was okay to lather up, put my head under. That's how much paranoia I still had. So I'm getting comfortable with her somewhat. And then all of a sudden, her ex-boyfriend sends her a dozen roses. And we come up to her house, and she's a school teacher, and the dozen roses are at the door, and she thinks it's for me, and it's not. So I didn't have coping skills, man. I didn't have a lot of emotional muscle. I mean, my muscle was here. It wasn't in here, okay?
Right.
That would take a long time to develop. So I wound up getting pretty upset about it. And then a couple weeks went by, and we're driving down a major road in Long Island, and I see her face go kind of blank. And I go, what's going on? She goes, oh, that's my ex going into the travel agency. I said, the one that sent you the roses? And she said, yeah. And Matt, I told her to stop the Blazer, and she might have just got she did get one shot at the brakes. I mean, she was doing 35 at least. And I jumped out of the vehicle to get this guy, because that's where my skills were back then. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew and had fear that this guy was going to take away something that was giving me some semblance in my life. And I was fear-based. So I went into after I almost got hit by a lot of cars going down the road and getting all scraped up, and they at first thought to call an ambulance. It was like the Terminator scene with Arnold when he was laid out, You think he's done, but he's not. No, I wasn't done, Matt. I was all scraped up, busted up. But I would get up from the highway, and I'd go into that travel agency. And, when I ran in, they said, call the police. I said, I am the police. And they didn't know what to think. And I grabbed the guy by the collar, and I dragged him out of the travel agency. And he was not a fighter. And I said, you sent these roses. I said, you're never going to send this girl have any communication again. And it caused some problems with us. She was a school teacher. The detectives wound up showing up at school, questioning her about what had happened. Luckily, it didn't get me in jail. But the thing was, that's what pushed her and said, look, I'm from Nebraska. It's not going to work with you out here. There's just too much bad history here. So we moved to Nebraska, Matt. And, you ask a New York guy about Nebraska. You ask questions. You say to a New York guy, hey, I'm thinking about moving to Nebraska. And they've done their research a little bit. And they said, Charlie, it's very dangerous. They got tornadoes. I mean, I'm a tornado here. So we wind up moving, Matt. And I'm thinking in my mind, now, the thing about Nebraska is Omaha and Lincoln is pretty developed, okay? I mean, they're not in a stone age. I mean, back then it was 250,000 people in Lincoln. Omaha is over 500,000. So I'm thinking I'm going to go out there and maybe do some farming, maybe do something else, right?
Yeah, but it's not New York.
It's not New York.
No.
So Matt, her father-in-law suggested that I get a job in the Department of Corrections. So that was like the last place I really needed to go. Last place. So I took a job with the Department of Corrections. After a tough vetting session, I went in, I did well on the test. It took time. Eventually they called me. And
you didn't have a criminal history or anything.
I had a bunch of, like I talked about in the 7-5, I had arrests that didn't really amount to anything. You get locked up for a misdemeanor, it gets squashed or this or that. So there was some stuff there, but it wasn't enough for them to really take a double look. But they did keep an eye on me, and they gave me an opportunity, Matt.
Right.
And I got a job in the Department of Corrections. Now, the Department of Corrections could hire you and you could go to work release. They could hire you and you could work in the youth facility. But I get hired and I wind up going to the penitentiary. And then I don't.
Why do you think that? Why would they send you, like, you're a rookie? Why would they send you to?
They did, Matt. They sent, I remember going through not OJT, but the academy. And I was a big guy, and I did real good on their PPCT and this and that. They just divide up the crowd and they sent me to the penitentiary. And I'm going to wind up with the worst job in the penitentiary when I get there. It's a job that Nebraska's got their own way of doing things. And I am really for this deal. So in the penitentiary, no matter what you're in there, whether it's death row whether it's multiple homicides, they want to keep you having visits with your family, okay? Which family and friends, and it makes sense when you think about it psychologically. No glass in between you.
If you guys didn't know, I do paintings, and if you're interested in a painting, I'm going to leave my contact information in the description beneath the video. Back to the video.
No,
So-
it makes sense. I'm used from the Bureau of Prison. They make it very difficult for you to. It's like, they say that it's very important for us to have you communicate with your family and visitation, but they make it so difficult for it to actually happen. But I absolutely agree. Like, your family will keep you sane in prison.
Yes.
They'll keep you behaving in prison.
And I get it. And I understood what they did there. I really did. And what occurred was, I'm working this job, and why it's a bad job is because you have an inmate that don't have a great attitude. You got the family that's not happy about the inmate being locked up. And the only person that's in between you and them is the CO. So I quickly understood, like this one woman said, I'm here to see my baby. And her baby was a guy that was so dangerous. We had something called a control unit. He had fought staff every single day, 4 cell moves, you name it, this guy fought. I mean, he was built like Thomas Hitman Hearns. So he was lanky, muscular, and strong. And anytime we saw this guy in the unit, he had to be filmed back then with the video camera, because it was use of force after use of force. But in the visiting room, there'd be no belly chain, there'd be no restraints. He would be free to visit mom, and it was just me, him, and mom. So what I quickly understood, Matt, was this. I possessed something that no other CO possessed. I had been to the darkest places a person could be. And I understood these guys. And I understood that sometimes you don't have the coping skills or the emotional muscle to make the right choice. And what the public doesn't understand, that they want to call inmates convicts or hardened criminals, is that not everybody's Charlie Manson in there, and far and few between. And there were just a lot of human beings that were mishandled as kids, that didn't have any role models. And they grow up with no skill set. And they don't learn how to make a living, and different things happen. So these guys quickly understand, and they would whisper stuff when I would have to put belly chains on them to go back to the seg units, because that's pretty miserable, Matt, doing 23 hours a day locked up, and your only yard is the light of day, that you look up at the sky, you don't see nothing, you see 40-foot walls, all right? So they quickly understood, and communication a lot of times is more gets communicated without words. So they knew that something had happened to me. And I remember inmates looking in my eyes. My eyes told a lot, man. There was still a lot of anger in my eyes. And I always reminded them, I'm a human being, and I deserve to be treated like one. I don't care if you're mad at the state for sentencing you. I'm a human being, and I'm going to treat you like a human being. And I wound up doing a lot of visits. I did a lot of death row visits where the time was out with these guys. I mean, I took a cup of coffee out of one inmate's hands that was going to be put in the electric chair. It was his final visit in the visiting room before he went up to the hospital. And I quickly understood that I should never judge anybody, because there were people that were free when I was working corrections that were going to work every day, had a family, and flipped out one day and may kill their wife or killed a neighbor, and they wound up in the penitentiary. So for those that say it can't happen to them, let me tell you, there's a lot of ways to get there. Financial hardship, greed, lust, you name it. So that was my stint. I did 3 institutions, and I wound up working death row, and I wound up working for a brief time at a county jail. And
how long did you work on death row?
Death row, I wound up doing about close to 3 years on death row, and I'm the first Here's an example. Here's the kind of person I was. I told the truth, Matt. I would never embellish, man. I would never lie. And a death row inmate used me first time in American history as a character witness because he wanted his death row sentence commuted to life in prison. And in front of the Nebraska Supreme Court, I was called as a witness. And I was asked about what he does every day, how he conducts himself. And his argument was that he follows the prison mission statement. And his argument was that it's cruel and unusual punishment. And he cited other cases. And, you know, whatever happened, I don't know if I was the reason, he wound up getting a life sentence. He got that sentence turned. And here's what I want to say, Matt, and I'm going to stick with this. For those that believe in the death penalty, number one, they've never worked a death penalty. They never worked death row, because the families of those that are seeking justice never feel any better after we kill an inmate. They don't.
Right.
It's very hard on staff. You only hear from the wardens. You never hear about the staff that has to work with the inmates. And in this country, justice without mercy is cruel. Okay? And we can't forget that. We don't have an eye for an eye justice system. So somebody might say to me, well, Charlie, if it was your family member, you're darn right. You know, at the time of incident, I'd want to kill him. Okay, if somebody hurt my family. But that's not how we run the justice system. And for those that don't know, I mean, doing time in prison is a lot harder than laying down on in Nebraska don't have the electric chair anymore. It has lethal injection. But doing time every day is a lot harder than being put to sleep. Okay? And prison taught me a lot of stuff, Matt. And I would go from prison. I got 10 years in. I couldn't go any further. I didn't want to go any further. And I left as a prison official. I had gone from an officer. I jumped up to sergeant status, which is a caseworker. Then I worked at multiple institutions. And then I became their safety director for the Department of Corrections, for the Nebraska Department of Corrections. And that title, what that meant is I was like the Fauci of corrections. You know the way Fauci kind of does his own thing? Nobody, who reels Fauci in? Nobody. That's the way I was with corrections. I made sure everything was running. I went to the hospital to make sure that all the drugs were accounted for. I went and made sure the electric chair's fire extinguisher was fully charged. I had keys to the whole institution. So here's a guy that one time slept in a park as a homeless kid. Here's a guy that wound up in East New York, drug addicted. Eventually, I became the safety director of the Nebraska Department of Corrections at the penitentiary, and that title allowed me to kind of move along any way I wanted to, left, right, and it was a great job.
Hey, I appreciate you guys checking out the video. Do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. You know, like the video, hit the bell so you get notified of videos like this, and leave a comment in the comment section, and I will try and respond to all of your comments. And I appreciate you checking it out and checking out Charlie's story, and all of his stuff's going to be in the description. And thank you very much for sticking with me. See ya.